"We don't need your help anymore. Just stay out of it." That single text shattered a bond built over decades. It wasn't just a rejection, it was dismissal, betrayal, and erasure rolled into one. Imagine giving everything you have, only to be told you're no longer needed. That wound doesn't bleed on the surface. It cuts deeper, leaving scars that change the way you see love, loyalty, and family forever. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. The desert has its own rhythm, and after nearly 7 decades of life, I find myself attuned to it. Every morning in Scottsdale begins the same way. The horizon shifts from violet to coral, then finally to a pale gold that spills over the McDowell Mountains. The air carries a dry crispness, almost metallic, the kind of sharpness I used to associate with the hiss of welding torches in my workshop. By the time the first rays of sun strike the flat roof of my mid-century house, the air conditioners hum to life, their steady vibration like the heartbeat of the neighborhood. I sit on the back patio with my coffee, watching the desert shed its cool night skin and brace itself for the heat that always follows. Routine has become a form of solace for me. I'm 68 years old, and though I sold most of Ridgeway Metalworks, I kept a small corner of the workshop. The clang of tools and the smell of cut metal remind me of the years I spent building something from scratch, back when sweat and grit meant more than paperwork and stock prices. I never was one for idle hands, so keeping a place to tinker with sheet metal projects, small ductwork, a weather vane here, a repaired tool there, keeps me from drifting. Work, in some form, has always been my compass. The house itself has aged gracefully. A single-story spread from the 50s with long horizontal lines, clerestory windows, and a living room that swallows the desert light whole. I remodeled parts of it myself, but I left the imperfections intact. To me, a house without a few scars feels dishonest. My late wife, Diane, used to laugh at how I'd run my hand along a wall like I was reading Braille, saying every nick and scratch told a story. She's been gone a long time now, but I still hear that laugh on mornings when the light falls just right. Family was supposed to replace the silence she left behind. That was my plan. My son, Caleb, and his wife, Brooke, bought their own house in Arcadia Light, a neighborhood of citrus trees and modest ranches tucked near Phoenix. It wasn't really their purchase, though. I put up the $420,000 through a promissory note, secured by a first deed of trust, because I wanted them to have a place to settle. I kept the taxes, HOA dues, and insurance on auto pay through Ridgeway Holdings, an LLC I formed years ago for just such matters. It made their life easier, or at least I thought it did. Caleb is 33 now, bright but restless, always chasing opportunities without holding on to them long enough for roots to take. Brooke is sharper, focused on marketing and image, the kind of woman who documents brunch like it's breaking news. Their house, a low-slung ranch from 1959, became my way of anchoring them. I believed a roof could do for them what discipline and labor once did for me: hold them steady. I told myself a house would keep us all connected, the way screws keep a sheet of metal from rattling loose. I remember painting the backyard fence with Caleb the summer after they moved in. He had a brush in hand, earbuds dangling, music leaking into the air, while I tuned into the baseball game on the radio. We didn't talk much, but for me, it was enough. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the tart scent of oranges drifting from a neighbor's yard, and I thought, this is how bonds are made, in small, ordinary moments. Still, in quieter hours, I've wondered whether my so-called help was really help at all. Maybe it was just a way of avoiding harder conversations. It's easier to write checks or set up payments than to sit across from your grown child and admit you expect respect in return. Houses can store memories, yes, but they can't manufacture gratitude. I've begun to see that distinction more clearly with age, though I can't say I like the view. Some evenings, when I walk the property lines of my own place, I imagine houses as silent witnesses. The bricks and beams record every argument, every celebration, every silence that fills the air. They don't lie. And lately, when I look at Caleb and Brooke's house from afar, I fear its memory is more of entitlement than appreciation. That thought sits in my chest like a loose rivet, clattering against metal each time the wind changes. The desert doesn't tolerate illusions. Out here, you can't hide decay for long. The sun exposes it, the dryness amplifies it. I suppose families are no different. You can try to cover the cracks with paint, but eventually the structure tells the truth. My morning ritual on the patio ends the same way each day, watching the light fill every corner until there's nowhere for shadows to hide. It's peaceful, but it's also a reminder. Even the strongest walls can't hold what people won't. I sipped the last of my coffee, listening to the whir of the neighbor's pool pump and the faint bark of a dog down the street. On mornings like this, I still believed I had done right by my son, but a quiet unease had already begun to settle beneath the surface, the kind that whispers that even the most solid foundations can fracture. I didn't know it yet, but the first crack was already there, waiting for the right moment to spread. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of that first wound, drop a number 1 in the comments so I know you understand the pain. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind that should have been ordinary. I was in my workshop, tightening bolts on a small duct assembly, when my phone buzzed. I wiped the grease from my hands, expecting a reminder or maybe a note from an old friend. Instead, the screen lit with 7 words that froze me in place. "We don't need your help with the house anymore." Caleb's name sat above the message like a headline. Brooke's silence was louder than anything she could have typed. I read it once, then again. The words didn't change, but the meaning hollowed me out like rust eats through steel. It wasn't just the message, it was the finality in the tone. No explanation, no warmth, not even a polite cushion. Just a cold line break in the story I thought we were still writing together. The phone slipped back onto the workbench, screen dimming, but those 7 words glowed in my mind. I thought of every time I had stepped in quietly. The HOA dues I had kept on autopay so they'd never get warning letters. The county taxes I absorbed without mentioning. The roof repair after a summer monsoon storm that had peeled shingles like pages from a book. The irrigation fix that kept their lemon tree alive. None of it had been dramatic. It had just been steady, invisible. And maybe that was the problem. Invisible help becomes invisible gratitude. I leaned against the bench, hands pressing into the cool metal, and let the weight settle. Had I been giving too much for too long? Was I teaching my son to stand on his own? Or had I simply built him a platform so wide he never felt the ground beneath him? I wanted to blame them for entitlement, but part of me knew I had trained them for it. It is easier to pay than to confront. Easier to write a check than to insist on a conversation about responsibility. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the reply box. I could have typed a dozen things: anger, sarcasm, guilt, but every word felt like fuel poured on an already smoldering pile. So I did something I rarely do. I chose silence. If they wanted no help, then I would give them no help. Not an argument, not a fight, just exactly what they asked for. I went back to my office and powered up the old desktop that still hummed like a tractor. The HOA portal was the first tab I opened. Cancel autopay. I clicked and confirmed. Next came the Maricopa County tax site. Remove payment method. Another confirmation. The insurance carrier was last, and I closed the loop with one more click. Each cancellation was like the snip of wire cutters, severing ties I had woven strand by strand over years. It hurt, but it also felt precise, deliberate, the way cutting excess metal from a design makes the final piece cleaner. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Sophia Grant. She had been my lawyer for a decade, sharp-minded and steady, the kind of person who made contracts feel less like weapons and more like tools. She answered in her even, measured tone. "Sophia, it's Marshall," I said. "Morning, Marshall. What can I do for you?" "I need you to pull the promissory note and the deed of trust on Caleb's house. It's time we looked at them again." There was a pause, not of surprise, but of recognition. The $420,000 demand note? That's the one, I replied. I'll review the documents this afternoon. As you know, it's secured by the first deed of trust. You hold all rights of acceleration. If you want repayment, you can demand it at any time. Her voice was professional, calm, but the words struck me with quiet power. I had always known the note was structured that way. I had just never considered exercising it. Until now. Let's make sure everything is in order, I told her. I don't want to move rashly, but I need to be ready. I'll prepare a summary for you. Do you want me to draft a demand letter? Not yet, I said. For now, just make it clean. I want no loose bolts in this structure. After we hung up, I took out my old leather ledger from the study. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, dates of repairs, checks I had written, receipts folded neatly. I had recorded each one without really knowing why. Now the pattern stared back at me, year after year of invisible labor, quietly underwriting someone else's adulthood. I closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. My hands were steady. My mind, for the first time in a long while, was clear. Caleb had asked me not to help. I was finally going to listen. And in honoring his request, I would also honor myself. If you're still watching and sensing how small cracks can grow into something larger, comment number 2 below to show you're following along. The first week after I canceled the autopay felt strangely quiet. For years, I had lived in the background of Caleb and Brooke's life, an invisible system keeping their household humming. Taxes paid on time, HOA dues processed, insurance premiums handled before anyone had to glance at a reminder. When I pulled the plug, I half expected an immediate explosion of calls and accusations. Instead, there was silence. It reminded me of shutting down an old compressor at the shop. At first, the air grows still, almost peaceful, but you know the pressure will eventually find another way out. It didn't take long. By the second week, the cracks appeared. The HOA sent out a delinquency notice, a plain white envelope stamped with their logo, reminding the residents of Arcadia Light that community rules had teeth. Then came a county bill, stiff with legalese, demanding payment for the first half of property taxes. The insurance carrier followed with a polite but pointed letter, asking for updated payment information to avoid lapse in coverage. All of these letters, once intercepted by my systems and handled before Caleb even noticed, now landed squarely in his mailbox. Brooke was the first to break. A text came through one afternoon while I was finishing a small welding project in my workshop. "Did you change the insurance info?" she wrote. No greeting, no context, just a sharp question that carried both confusion and irritation. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "You said you didn't need help. I'm respecting that." Her reply never came. I imagined her standing in their immaculate kitchen, phone in hand, lips tight with disbelief. They had drawn the line, and I was simply honoring it. For years, my silence had been interpreted as permission. Now it was boundary. Meanwhile, Sophia moved with her usual precision. She drafted the demand letter and sent me a copy before mailing it to Caleb and Brooke. The tone was professional, almost cold in its clarity. Repayment of the $420,000 promissory note required within 30 days, or acceleration would take effect and foreclosure proceedings could begin under the first deed of trust. Attached were certified copies of both documents, stamped and notarized. Seeing my son's name in that context, a borrower, a debtor, no longer just a child, was like watching a blueprint of our relationship redrawn in black ink. When I signed the letter, I didn't feel rage or vindication. I felt something steadier, like turning off a faulty breaker before it sparks a fire. Sometimes silence and paperwork are sharper than arguments. That evening, I sat on the patio with a glass of water, the desert sky bleeding from orange to indigo, and considered what this meant. For years, my support had been like an invisible current, keeping their lights on. Now the bills were speaking for themselves, each envelope a reminder of reality. And reality, unlike me, doesn't negotiate. But I wasn't finished. After the demand letter was in motion, I asked Sophia to prepare an assignment of the note, A week later, at her office, I signed a transfer that redirected the entire debt, every cent of the $420,000, into the Ridgeway Houseworks Fellowship, a scholarship fund I had just founded. From now on, any repayment from Caleb and Brooke, or any proceeds from foreclosure, would no longer funnel back into my accounts. It would go directly to cover toolkits, tuition, and apprenticeship costs for students at Maricopa community colleges who wanted to learn trades like HVAC, plumbing, or sheet metal work. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. My son had rejected my help, but others were waiting, hungry for opportunity, willing to put in sweat where entitlement had replaced effort. Every dollar Caleb once treated as family charity would now become the lifeblood of someone else's future. Driving home that day, I felt lighter than I had in months. The desert air rushed through the truck's open window, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. I realized I had finally taken my son's words seriously. He didn't want my help with his house anymore. Fine. My help was going elsewhere, to people who would value it, to hands that would turn wrenches and measure ductwork with the same quiet pride that once fueled me. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, I was back on my patio, ledger open beside me. I noted the actions taken: auto pay canceled, demand letter issued, note assigned to fellowship. 3 simple lines, but they carried decades of weight. The silence around me was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of a system recalibrating, of boundaries finally holding. I closed the book, leaned back in my chair, and listened to the desert night settle in. Somewhere across town, Caleb and Brooke were opening envelopes they had never bothered to notice before. The game had begun, though they didn't yet realize they were playing. If you're still watching and shocked by how quickly the mask of security slips away, type number 3 in the comments so I know you caught it. The pile of envelopes on Caleb and Brooke's counter grew taller each day, stark against the polished quartz they had once been so proud of. A week earlier, their home had felt like a sanctuary, a curated space of scented candles and carefully arranged decor. Now it looked like a staging ground for battle, every unopened letter another skirmish they were losing. I imagined the tension in their rooms at night, the kind that seeps through drywall and keeps sleep from ever settling. Caleb was the first to break the silence. "We'll handle it," he told Brooke, his tone tight, like a man trying to believe his own lie. She pointed at the demand letter lying in the center of the counter, its thick paper radiating authority. 30 days, $420,000. There was no mistaking the gravity. He tried to buy time. The next morning, he met with a loan officer at a downtown branch. He dressed in his best suit, pressed though not new, and rehearsed a pitch about refinancing the house. The officer, polite but detached, looked over his file, tapping a pen against the margin. Caleb's unstable job history, combined with existing credit obligations, made him ineligible. Worse still, the property was tied up under a first deed of trust in my name. "Without the lien holder's release," the officer said, "there's nothing we can do." Caleb walked out, realizing that the independence he bragged about had always been borrowed air. Brooke, unwilling to wait on his efforts, tried her own approach. She applied for several credit cards, expecting generous limits to cover insurance, taxes, and HOA dues. The approvals came swiftly, but each line of credit was meager, barely enough for groceries, let alone structural bills. The embarrassment stung her pride. In a moment of desperation, Caleb sat down with a friend of a friend, someone who offered bridge loans at suffocating rates. The terms read like a trap: astronomical interest, penalties for early repayment, liens layered on top of liens. Even in their desperation, they could see it was poison. They left empty-handed, rattled by the realization that no one wanted to bet on them without me standing quietly behind them. Out of options, they turned to acquaintances they once considered part of their social circle. Brooke reached out discreetly, arranging coffees that turned awkward the moment money was mentioned. The polite refusals carried undertones of judgment, as if word had already leaked that their financial scaffolding was collapsing. The whispers spread quickly, neighbors noticing late payments, friends side-eyeing when Brooke dodged brunch invitations. For her, the humiliation of public exposure was worse than the unpaid bills. Back at my own house, the days passed quietly. I mowed the gravel paths between my cactus beds, tended to small projects in the workshop, and jotted notes in my ledger. Sophia kept me updated in short, factual calls. Attempts at refinancing denied, inquiries about quick loans documented, credit applications noted. Each report confirmed what I already knew, that Caleb and Brooke were facing limits for the first time in their adult lives. I felt no glee, no smugness, only the calm satisfaction of a boundary holding firm. Then came the discovery that shifted their panic into something darker. Caleb, poring over the demand documents in frustration, noticed an assignment filed at the county recorder's office. The promissory note had been transferred, not to another bank, not to a faceless investor, but to the Ridgeway Houseworks Fellowship. When he told Brooke, her disbelief turned instantly into fury. "What do you mean it doesn't even go back to him?" she demanded. "We're breaking our backs over this, and it funds strangers." Caleb had no answer. He sat at the table, face pale, staring at the legal notice. For years, he had thought of my money as a family inheritance, a river flowing endlessly in his direction. Now that river had been rerouted, feeding students who wanted to learn trades at Maricopa community colleges. Apprentices, toolkits, scholarships, all built on the debt he had dismissed as just family help. The irony cut sharper than any past argument. That night, their unity fractured. Brooke accused him of weakness, of failing to protect the life they had built. Caleb snapped back, lashing out with defensiveness. The walls of their house echoed with raised voices, but no amount of shouting could produce the money they owed. Each unpaid bill sat silently between them, a more powerful judge than either of their words. I wrote a single line in my ledger. "They now know the note belongs to the fellowship." Then I closed the book. The desert outside was calm, cicadas buzzing low in the evening heat. Across town, my son and his wife were learning, for the first time, that control is an illusion when it's built on someone else's foundation. If you're still watching and realizing desperation doesn't always lead to answers, leave number 4 below to let me know you're still here. The invitation arrived in the form of a short text from Caleb. "Dad, let's have dinner. Just the 3 of us. We need to talk." No apologies, no warmth, just a summons wrapped in polite wording. I knew what it was, a stage set for negotiation. Still, I agreed, not because I expected reconciliation, but because sometimes you have to see the performance in person to understand its desperation. When I walked into their Arcadia Light home that evening, the effort was obvious. The dining table gleamed, wine glasses caught the light from candles, and the air carried the scent of rosemary chicken. It was too perfect, too deliberate, like a photograph staged for a magazine. Brooke greeted me at the door with a smile stretched tight across her face. Caleb hovered behind her, jaw clenched, as if every muscle was working to hold his composure. We sat down. For a few minutes, the talk floated on the surface. Brooke asked about my garden. I mentioned the roses. Caleb made a comment about the heat, his voice brittle, but the air hummed with tension, like wires buzzing before they snap. The food on our plates cooled, untouched. Finally, Caleb leaned forward, pushing his fork aside. "Dad, this demand letter, this isn't reasonable. You know we can't pull 400 grand in 30 days. We just need time." His words were sharp, rehearsed, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. Brooke chimed in, her tone mixing sugar with accusation. "And why would you take the note and hand it over to some scholarship fund? We're your family. You're supposed to support us, not strangers." I let their words hang in the air. The candles flickered, shadows dancing across their carefully painted walls. They didn't notice my silence. They filled it with more pleading, more justifications. Caleb spoke of building a life, as though life were something bought in installments. Brooke spoke of humiliation, how friends whispered and neighbors looked down on them. Not once did either mention responsibility, only what they believed they were owed. The facade cracked when Caleb's voice rose. "This isn't fair," he snapped, slamming his fist onto the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. Brooke startled, then turned her face into her hands, tears sliding down her cheeks. "How could you do this to us?" she sobbed. "We trusted you." Their performance was raw, but it wasn't reconciliation. It was survival theater. They weren't trying to mend anything. They were trying to reclaim what they believed was theirs by right. I studied their faces, the desperation etched deep, and felt a mix of ache and clarity. My late wife, Diane, would have seen through it too. She always said dignity mattered more than appeasement. As they spoke over each other, a slip escaped Caleb's lips, sharp enough to cut the room in half. "We could have just sold the place months ago and kept the equity," he blurted. "You'd never even know." The words hung heavy, louder than his shout. Brooke froze, her eyes flashing with shock. "What?" she demanded, turning toward him. His face went pale, realizing too late what he had revealed. They hadn't just planned to live off my support. They had considered cashing out the very house secured by my note, pocketing whatever profit they could, and cutting me out entirely. That was the truth beneath all their pleading, not gratitude, not partnership, but betrayal simmering just beneath the surface. The dinner, meant to soften me, had exposed their hand in the ugliest way possible. I took a slow breath, set my napkin neatly on the table, and rose from my chair. "Thank you for dinner," I said evenly. My voice carried no anger, no raised pitch, just finality. The scrape of the chair across the floor was louder than anything else. Neither of them moved as I walked to the door. Brooke's tears blurred her face into a mask of anguish. Caleb stared at the table, stunned by his own confession. The click of the latch behind me felt like a gavel striking wood. Out in the desert night, the air was cooler, the stars sharp against the sky. I felt the ache of loss, but I also felt clarity. They had shown me everything I needed to see. There was no reconciliation at that table, only desperation. And sometimes the strongest answer you can give is not a fight, but silence, backed by unshakable boundaries. When I left Caleb and Brooke's house that night, the desert felt colder than usual. The air carried a sharp edge, the kind you feel just before dawn in winter. My truck's headlights cut through the quiet streets as I drove home, replaying the evening in my mind. The carefully set table, the scent of rosemary chicken, the desperate pleading disguised as reconciliation, all of it clung to me like smoke. But it was Caleb's slip, those words about selling the house without telling me, that echoed the loudest. It wasn't just entitlement anymore, it was betrayal. Back at my own place, I poured a glass of water and sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and I found myself staring at them as though they might hold an answer. I thought about the boy who once held a paintbrush beside me, dripping white streaks onto a backyard fence. That boy had been replaced by a man who could imagine cutting me out entirely, cashing in on what I had built, and calling it his own. The ache in my chest was sharp, but beneath it, there was also clarity. The next morning, I drove to Sophia Grant's office. Her firm sat in a glass-fronted building in Scottsdale, sleek and unyielding, much like her. She welcomed me into her office with the steady professionalism I had come to rely on. I recounted the dinner, describing the shouting, the tears, and finally Caleb's confession. She listened without interruption, her pen gliding across her legal pad in neat strokes. When I finished, she set the pen down and leaned back. "Marshall," she said, her voice calm, "that admission changes everything. If he had followed through, it would have been a clear attempt to defraud you as the lien holder. As it stands, it reinforces your position. The note is demand-based. The deed of trust secures it. You have every right to accelerate repayment or foreclose if necessary. His words only strengthen your legal footing." Hearing it framed so plainly was like having a blueprint laid out before me. The structure was sound, the supports were strong. All I had to do was follow the design. "I don't want a spectacle," I told her. "No shouting, no courtroom drama, just keep it clean. Quiet steps, every one of them. If they don't pay, we proceed." Sophia nodded. "Understood. Silence can be the sharpest instrument." That phrase stayed with me as I left her office. Silence had always been my refuge after Diane's death, but now it was becoming my weapon. I didn't need to trade accusations with Caleb or endure Brooke's tearful manipulations. The law was in place. The papers were signed. Their deadlines would speak louder than I ever could. The texts began arriving within days. At first, they were half-hearted attempts. "Dad, let's talk. We need to find a solution." I let them sit unanswered, their blue bubbles fading into silence. Then the tone shifted, turning sharper. "You're really going to do this to your own son? Think about what Mom would want." Each one stung in its own way, but I refused to take the bait. My silence became the ultimatum. At night, I walked the perimeter of my property, gravel crunching under my boots, the stars stretched across the desert sky. I thought about what it meant to be both a father and a man who had to enforce boundaries. The two roles pulled at me, but in the end, one truth anchored me. Love without respect corrodes into servitude, and I had served long enough. In the workshop, I busied myself with small projects, repairing an old weather vane, polishing the brass fittings on a vintage lamp. Each task was a reminder that order comes from steady hands, not frantic noise. My silence was not absence. It was design. It was the sound of consequences drawing closer. One evening, as I pruned the rose bushes Diane had planted years ago, I felt the quiet settle around me like armor. The thorns pricked my gloves as I clipped away dead branches, making space for new growth. That was what I was doing with Caleb and Brooke, cutting back what had grown wild, leaving room for something sturdier to emerge, even if it took years. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in red and violet streaks, I had reached peace with my choice. I wouldn't answer their calls. I wouldn't argue my case. The paperwork was already in motion, and the silence between us would carry more weight than any words I could offer. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the stillness inside me align with the stillness outside. The desert held its breath, and so did I. My ultimatum had been delivered, not with raised voices or threats, but with silence. A silence they could no longer ignore. The 30th day was still 2 weeks away when the first real cracks began to show. I had marked the deadline in my ledger with a simple red X, nothing more than ink on paper. Yet in another part of the city, that date loomed like a thundercloud over Caleb and Brooke's house. Each passing day tightened the noose, and while my evenings were quiet and steady, theirs were filled with arguments sharp enough to slice through the walls. The HOA was first to speak. A bright orange late fee notice was taped directly to their front door, large enough for every neighbor on the block to see. The paper flapped in the Arizona wind, a flag of embarrassment. For years, the HOA fees had slipped silently from my account into theirs, and no one gave it a thought. Now, with my hand withdrawn, the community's polite veneer cracked into judgment. Brooke tore the notice down before noon, but the damage was done. The neighbors had seen. A few days later, the insurance company followed. A letter arrived stating the homeowner's policy had lapsed for non-payment. The words were formal, almost detached, but the meaning was brutal. Their prized home was uninsured. Caleb read it twice, the lines carving into him, realizing the foundation of their so-called security was evaporating faster than he could patch it. The county tax assessor's office delivered the next blow. A lien notice arrived by certified mail, stamped in bold letters that warned of enforcement action. Caleb had once mocked me for being meticulous about taxes, claiming younger people didn't need to worry so much about old man paperwork. Now he stood in his kitchen, holding the document as though it were a death warrant. The truth finally settled. No one was shielding him anymore. Social consequences moved in just as quickly as the financial ones. Brooke, who had once thrived on brunches, yoga sessions, and charity committee meetings, found her invitations drying up. Friends who had once gushed over her handbags and vacations began avoiding her calls. At yoga class, she caught the sidelong glances, the whispers barely concealed behind manicured hands. Their financial unraveling was no longer private. It was neighborhood theater, and they were the unwilling stars. Meanwhile, I went about my life with calm precision. Sophia sent me copies of each notice: the HOA delinquency, the insurance lapse, the lien. I placed them neatly in a file and noted each in my ledger, not with malice, but with the detached satisfaction of an engineer watching a design follow its natural course. Silence wasn't vengeance, it was structure asserting itself after years of imbalance. But Caleb wasn't finished trying. In a final desperate act, he applied for a home equity line of credit at a bank across town, hoping to slip one past me. He presented himself as the confident homeowner, the provider securing his family's future. Yet the bank's underwriters uncovered the truth within days. The property was already bound by my first deed of trust, recorded and ironclad. The application was denied outright and flagged for potential fraud. The humiliation was deeper than rejection. It was exposure. The banker's polite but pointed phone call left him shaken. Word of such attempts had a way of traveling quietly through financial circles. The pressure twisted the marriage tighter than a vice. Brooke lashed out in one of their late-night arguments, her voice carrying into the street. "I didn't marry into poverty, Caleb. I won't be dragged down with you." Her words, overheard by neighbors walking dogs in the cool evening, cut sharper than any formal notice. Caleb shouted back, but his defensiveness sounded hollow. The unity they once wielded against me was fracturing under the weight of unpaid bills and public humiliation. The final humiliation came one sun-bleached afternoon when a repossession truck rumbled down their street. Its diesel engine growled as it stopped in front of their driveway. Neighbors emerged from porches and windows, watching with quiet fascination as the tow operator backed in and began hooking chains around the sleek SUV Brooke had flaunted as a symbol of status. She rushed onto the porch, her face pale, frozen in disbelief. The man showed her the paperwork: delinquent lease, lien holder, the Thorn Trust. The neighbors didn't need explanations. They had their spectacle. Caleb stood in the driveway, fists clenched but powerless, as the SUV was lifted from the pavement. The vehicle rolled away on the back of the tow truck, a modern chariot carrying away the last vestige of their curated image. The neighbors returned indoors, whispers already forming, their judgment sealed. That evening, as I sat on my patio, pruning my roses in the fading light, Sophia's brief update confirmed what I already knew. The collapse had begun in earnest. While Caleb and Brooke fought against the tide, I breathed in the desert air, steady and resolute. The silence around me was no longer heavy. It was clear, sharp, and full of inevitability. The repossession truck had left more than skid marks on the pavement. It had left an open wound in Caleb and Brooke's pride. For days afterward, Brooke could hardly step outside without feeling eyes on her. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly and now offered tight smiles or no greeting at all. Every whisper on the street, every pause in conversation at the grocery store, felt aimed directly at her. Caleb stopped jogging in the mornings, embarrassed to run into anyone who might mention the sight of his wife's SUV being hauled away like junk. Their collapse was no longer private. It was a performance, and the whole neighborhood had tickets to watch. In the silence that followed, desperation began to fester. Caleb started leaving long, rambling voicemails on my phone. "Dad, we can work this out. We just need to talk. Please, call me back." The words grew more pleading with each message, but they all dissolved into the void of blocked calls. Brooke tried a different approach, drafting a carefully worded email full of apologies and promises of change. She sent it late at night, hoping the vulnerability would catch my attention. I never opened it. Their words, once sharpened as weapons, now fell like stones into a bottomless well. Facing reality, they scheduled an emergency consultation with a financial advisor. Sitting across from a man in a crisp navy suit, they listened as he laid out the facts in blunt terms. "Without new income or selling assets, you cannot maintain this lifestyle," he said, sliding spreadsheets across the table. Caleb bristled at the word income, dismissing it as if he were above such concerns. Brooke, however, sat silently, staring at the numbers that stripped their life of illusion. For the first time, she saw their fragility laid bare on paper. When the advisor suggested downsizing, Caleb scoffed. "We just need a little time," he muttered. But Brooke's silence spoke louder than his defiance. They turned next to liquidating possessions. Brooke carried designer handbags into a consignment shop, where the clerk barely glanced at them before quoting figures far lower than she imagined. Watches, jewelry, even the modern furniture they had once boasted about, all fetched sums that felt insulting. Each sale bought them only days, a few bills covered, a little food on the table. The glamour of their possessions evaporated under fluorescent pawnshop lights. Meanwhile, my life remained steady. Sophia updated me in short calls. The repossession completed, insurance lapsed, more possessions sold. I marked each step in my ledger, noting it as if following a design unfolding precisely as drawn. From my garden, I watched roses climb their trellises, sawdust gathered in my workshop, and the desert air moved calmly across my property. Their chaos only underscored my peace. For years, I had been the net shielding them from gravity. Now they were learning what falling felt like. Caleb, unwilling to accept defeat, visited a bankruptcy attorney in secret. He imagined it as his escape, a reset button to erase the weight pressing down on him. But the lawyer explained in clear, unflinching terms that the secure deed of trust still gave me the upper hand. Bankruptcy might delay creditors, but it would not erase the obligation to the trust. Marshall Ridgway's lien stood firm, immune to his desperate gambit. The news crushed him. His last illusion of escape dissolved in that sterile office. That night, Brooke reached her breaking point. Tears welled as she hurled words at Caleb in their darkened kitchen. "I'm tired of the lies, the humiliation, your arrogance. This isn't a life, it's a nightmare." For once, she didn't sound like a partner defending him. She sounded like a woman standing on the edge of the leaving, and for the first time, she admitted aloud what I had known all along. "Maybe your father's right. Maybe this is what we deserve." Caleb's face twisted with panic. He grabbed her wrist, not in violence, but in desperation, terrified of losing the only ally he had left. "No, we can't quit now. He won't ignore us if we go to him directly. He has to face us." His words were sharp, frantic, carrying the weight of a drowning man reaching for anything that floated. Brooke hesitated, torn between exhaustion and fear. Yet, when Caleb insisted again, her resistance softened. Perhaps it was the faint hope of resolution, or simply the last shred of denial, but she nodded. "Fine, then we'll go." The decision was made. Their possessions were dwindling, their dignity already gone, but they believed a confrontation at my doorstep might force a miracle. As they prepared for the drive, packing desperation into every gesture, the silence of my house stood unbroken. I didn't need to plan a counter. The wall was already built, and they were choosing to run headfirst into it. The desert sun was sliding low, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and crimson when Caleb turned the key in the ignition of their last working car. The engine groaned as though even it resisted the trip. Brooke sat beside him in silence, her eyes fixed on the road, but her hands clenched tight on her lap. Their conversations had dwindled to fragments, his bursts of anger, her weary sighs. This drive wasn't a family visit. It was a last gamble, a desperate attempt to wrest control back from the silence that had been suffocating them. The road toward my property wound through the desert like a scar, pale dust lifting with every passing car. They said little. Caleb muttered curses under his breath, blaming me, blaming fate, blaming anyone but himself. Brooke leaned her head against the window, her reflection staring back at her with exhaustion etched deep. She had once driven this same stretch in a gleaming SUV, her world secure and enviable. Now, she arrived in a worn sedan, carrying nothing but desperation. When they reached the gates, the reality of my home loomed larger than they remembered. The tall stone walls stretched in either direction, unbroken, crowned with iron that glinted in the dying light. The intercom panel waited, cold and unwelcoming. Caleb pressed the button hard, his voice cracking as he barked. "Dad, open the gate. We need to talk." Brooke hovered close, her tone alternating between pleading and command. "Please, Marshall, just give us a chance. We're still your family." Inside my garden, I was already aware of them. My watch buzzed with a quiet alert. Vehicle approaching. I didn't rush. The roses required attention, and my hands were steady with the shears. I slipped my headphones over my ears and let box cello suites carry me away. Music and roses, two things that never demanded, never betrayed. At the gate, Caleb pressed again and again, his frustration mounting. "You can't ignore your own son," he shouted, his voice breaking the desert stillness. Brooke tried tears. "Do you really want to watch us lose everything? Is this what you want for us?" Her words trembled, but the iron bars held their silence. Every plea, every accusation fell flat against stone and steel. I saw them eventually, silhouettes pacing along the perimeter, searching for a weakness in the wall. They looked like castaways scouring cliffs for a passage that didn't exist. Caleb's arms flailed as he shouted into the void, his rage painting the air red. Brooke alternated between gestures of supplication and fists of anger. Their storm raged, but in my garden the world was calm, ordered, serene. The symbolism was clear even to me in that moment. They embodied noise, chaos, desperation. I embodied silence, patience, boundaries. For decades, I had bent to their tempests, patching over their messes with money and indulgence. Tonight, the roles reversed. They had no power here. Minutes dragged on before the sleek black security sedan arrived, pulling up quietly behind their car. Marcus, the guard who had patrolled the neighborhood for years, stepped out with the professionalism of a man who had seen 100 domestic dramas and would see 100 more. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply listened to their frantic words, nodded once, and said firmly, "You're on private property. The owner has asked for no disturbances. You need to leave." Caleb erupted, his voice ragged. "He can't do this to us. This is our family, our life." Brooke clutched Marcus's sleeve, her tears streaking mascara down her cheeks. "Please, just let us in. Please." But Marcus did not budge. Law was on his side, and silence on mine. Exhaustion finally replaced their fire. Caleb's shoulders slumped, his fury collapsing into emptiness. Brooke wiped her cheeks with trembling hands, staring at the gates as if willing them to open. They had nothing left to throw at me. No leverage, no power, only humiliation. They returned to their car like defeated soldiers, climbing inside as the neighbors across the street peeked from windows. Engines hummed, doors shut, and the sedan rolled forward, carrying them back to the city. Marcus waited until they disappeared down the road before leaving himself. The desert quiet rushed in again, pure and uninterrupted. I removed my headphones, letting the evening sounds settle. A finch chirping in the oak, the faint rustle of wind across gravel. I bent down and clipped a single crimson rose, its bloom rich and full. Holding it in my palm, I felt the weight of the moment. The confrontation was finished, not with shouts or violence, but with silence that could not be broken. For Caleb and Brooke, the gate marked the end of their control. For me, it marked the confirmation of something deeper. I had cut away the diseased branches. What remained might still hurt, but it would allow new growth. I walked back into my garden with the rose in hand, leaving behind nothing but silence at the gate. When Caleb and Brooke's car finally disappeared beyond the curve of the road, silence settled over my property like a soft blanket. The air felt lighter than it had in months. For the first time, the quiet wasn't heavy with absence. It pulsed with possibility. I stood among the roses, pruning shears in hand, and cut away a wilted bloom. The act felt symbolic. Sometimes you remove what is diseased or decayed not because you enjoy the loss, but because new growth cannot happen otherwise. In the weeks that followed, life moved at its own steady pace. I spent mornings in my workshop, evenings in the garden, and nights in the study with old books I had promised myself I would one day finish. Yet, there was also a new rhythm taking shape, one that stretched beyond my walls. The Ridgeway Next Generation Scholarship was no longer an idea on paper. It was alive, preparing to welcome its first class of recipients at Arizona State University. The day of the ceremony arrived on a cool spring morning. I stood at a podium in a modest auditorium, not surrounded by chandeliers or country club elites, but by eager students and proud parents. Their clothes weren't designer, but their eyes burned with determination. I spoke about the dignity of work, about mistakes as teachers, about the kind of wealth that doesn't come with dollar signs. A legacy, I told them, is not what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside of them. The applause that followed carried a warmth I hadn't felt in years. It was the sound of something real. Across town, life looked very different for Caleb and Brooke. Their penthouse was long gone, replaced by a cramped two-bedroom above a strip mall. The glamorous furniture had been sold, and now mismatched chairs and a second-hand sofa filled the living room. Caleb had taken a job as a logistics coordinator at a distribution warehouse. Each morning he donned a reflective vest, clipboard in hand, directing trucks under the Arizona sun. Brooke managed a small boutique, folding clothes for customers who didn't recognize her name or care about her past social circles. Their lives were no longer curated illusions. They were difficult, unpolished, and theirs. I won't pretend it didn't sting to imagine my son reduced from champagne brunches to punching a time clock. But perhaps it was the first honest chapter of his adult life. For years, I had written checks that shielded him from consequence. Now, consequence had become his teacher. The lesson was cruel but necessary. At night, I often sat on the porch with a glass of water, staring at the stars scattered across the desert sky. I thought about Diane, how she would have hated the path Caleb had taken, but also how she would have understood my decision. She used to tell me that love without respect rots into servitude. She was right. By withdrawing, I had forced space into our relationship. Space to fail, space to learn, space to possibly grow into something stronger. The final twist came one evening as the sun set, painting the horizon with violet and gold. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me. It wasn't a call this time, but a text from a number I didn't recognize. Just one word, followed by a question mark. Dad? I stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no entitlement, no demand, no anger, just a tentative question, an opening. The canyon of silence between us was vast, but here was a bridge, however fragile. I didn't answer right away. I set the phone face down and leaned back in my chair. Some messages don't require immediate replies. Sometimes the silence itself is the answer, at least for now. The roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere beyond the horizon, my son was working late. My daughter-in-law was folding clothes, and both were living the kind of life they had never known before. One measured not by indulgence but by effort. And here, in my garden, I felt peace. The lesson was clear, one I wanted etched not only into their lives but into mine as well. Generosity without boundaries breeds entitlement. But love balanced with limits can build respect. The truest legacy is not the wealth you leave behind, but the strength you instill in others to stand on their own. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The silence around me was no longer a void. It was full of meaning, full of hope, full of beginnings. And in that silence, for the first time in a very long time, I felt whole. True strength often reveals itself not in the act of giving, but in the decision to stop giving when generosity no longer nurtures growth. There comes a time when silence carries more weight than words, and boundaries speak louder than endless sacrifice. In that silence lies clarity, the recognition that love without respect becomes a burden, and provision without accountability becomes a prison for both sides. Life teaches us that endings are rarely clean. They unfold like a slow unraveling, stripping away illusions until only truth remains. Yet from that unraveling, new beginnings are possible. When walls are built not from bitterness, but from the need for dignity, they create the space for others to stumble, to struggle, and ultimately to rise on their own terms. Wealth, in its truest form, is never measured by the size of a house or the balance of a bank account. It is measured by resilience, by the lessons carved into the heart, and by the ability to stand even when safety nets are gone. Legacy is not what we leave for others to consume, but what we leave within them to endure. The deepest act of love, then, is not always holding on. Sometimes it is the quiet release, the granting of space for failure, for discovery, and for the slow forging of respect. In that release lies not abandonment, but the seed of transformation, and in that seed rests the possibility of renewal. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.